All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is David Fields, and I'm the Associate Director of the Center for East Asian Studies here on campus, which we affectionately call CEAS or CEAS. Welcome to this fifth event in our CEAS Professional series. We conceived of this event, this series, all the way back in 2019 as a way to bring to campus individuals who do serious work in East Asian studies, but who do so outside of the context of a university. Not that there's anything wrong with universities. We love universities, but we hope that this series will highlight the authors, journalists, filmmakers, and policymakers who make significant contributions to the understanding of East Asia, but who do so outside of the boundaries of an academic community. We also use this series to inform our students of the various career opportunities they can pursue with East Asian Studies credentials, and so we are delighted that our guest today has been willing to spend so much of his time meeting with students during this visit, including a talk at the Navy ROTC program this morning and meetings with CEAS Certificate in International Business students this afternoon. Before I forget, I want to thank the East Asian Legal Studies Center, the Madison Committee on Foreign Relations, and the UW International Business Program, especially Sachin Tuli, for making this event possible through their co-sponsorship. It's a true honor to welcome to campus David Rennie. David is the Geopolitics editor at The Economist and the author of The Telegram, The Economist's weekly column on geopolitics. More on that in just a minute. David has had a long and distinguished career in journalism, including stints at the Evening Standard and the Daily Telegraph prior to joining The Economist. At The Economist, David has served as the European Union correspondent and Charlemagne columnist, the British political editor and Badgett columnist, the Washington bureau chief and Lexington columnist. From May 2018 to September 2024, he was the Beijing bureau chief, and during that time, he launched the Chaguan column on China. He returned to London as a geopolitics editor and launched the Telegram column very recently in October 2024. Now, if you are a regular reader of The Economist, you know the names of these columns very well. And you also know that these columns are where some of the most interesting analysis can be found. And by my count, David has been the author and or creator of 5 of the 11 such columns that The Economist currently publishes. And what makes these columns so valuable is that their contents are not driven by breaking news, but by the insights that can only be gained through years of embedded reporting. So David's 220 Chaguan columns were written over 6.5 years, during which he lived in China and reported from every Chinese province and territory except Tibet, where he was never given permission to travel. Of course, he covered the familiar topics: trade wars, authoritarian politics, the oppression of minorities, but he also covered the revival of wearing traditional dress among Chinese youth, the plight of rural pig farmers, myopia in Chinese children, and China's ambition to become a world power in the sport of curling. Although I have not mined them as carefully, I have no doubt that David's writing in his other columns were just as interesting and as insightful as his Chaguan pieces. His newest column, The Telegram, takes its name from the long telegram, written by one of the United States' premier diplomats and fellow Wisconsinite, George F. Kennan, at a pivotal moment in the Cold War, when the United States was struggling to respond to Soviet hostility, renewed great power competition, and a changed international order. In the past few months, David has been using this column to ask some of the most fundamental and important questions, that are facing us today in geopolitics, such as, is the post-World War II order dying? Are Trumpian values the new American values? Is China really the stabilizing force in geopolitics that it wants to be seen as? David comes at these questions with decades of experience in China, but also in the United States and Europe, and so there are few better prepared to help us think through this current moment in U.S.-China relations and where it might be headed. So please join me in welcoming David Rennie.
Thank you very much. That's a very warm welcome. I think a public service announcement, there's a seat going empty there. If anyone at the back needs, there's 2 seats, in fact, just up here, because I hate to see people standing. So thank you so much for that welcome. And it's really terrific to be back in Wisconsin. I used to come here as the US political columnist. I spent a lot of time in swing states. I think I saw Barack Obama give us a talk here in 2012 when he was running for re-election. So it's great to be back. I have not had cheese curds yet, but I have hopes. I'm weirdly fond of cheese curds. So let me take you back to maybe the strangest time of my 10 years as a China-based columnist, correspondent, which is during the pandemic. So I did not leave China for the entirety of the pandemic, because if I had left, I would not have got back in. And so I was there for 2.5 years without leaving. And it was actually surprisingly, fine. I was not desperate to get out. I didn't see my family for 2.5 years, which was grim. But there were moments when all of us foreigners living in Beijing at the height of the pandemic did need some sort of taste of something that was outside China, some glimpse of a world that, was something like home. One of my favorite places to go was just off the main shopping street in the heart of Beijing, near Wangfujing. There's this strange cluster of what looks like the campus of an American university. There's these 1930s, very American-style villas around a tree-shaded courtyard. You could be at the university here. And this is, today, it's CEAS Hospital, and this is some doctors' residences. But the reason it looks American is it was built for American doctors. It was built for the medical missionaries of many of the big American missions at the very beginning of the 20th century, as they built what they called Peking Union Medical College. It was the best hospital in China. And their aim was to find Chinese doctors, train them up to be world-class physicians. And they were also helped by the Rockefeller Foundation. And they were drawing on a tradition that by kind of 1910, 1917, when this hospital was founded, was already decades old. The first Chinese student at an Ivy League college was Wang Ying in the 1870s at Yale, who then persuaded the dying imperial dynasty of China to allow Chinese students to study in New England. It was bumpy. The Qing dynasty court panicked that they'd become too westernized, brought them home in disgrace. Then the American government passed basically a racist law, the Chinese Exclusion Act, in 1881. But America that missionary spirit went beyond people who worked for a given church. It included the leading politicians and business leaders of the United States. And so after a sort of xenophobic clash in China in 1900, when the Boxers surrounded the legation quarter in Beijing, and the great Western powers basically broke the siege and then demanded these really cruel, punitive indemnities from China and burned down the Summer Palace and punished China very severely. The British, the French, the Germans, they took their cash in silver tiles from the Chinese empire. But the Americans, after a certain time, decided that this was a lost opportunity, that they did not want to be imperialist, colonial-minded powers like the British or the French or the Germans, and that America was going to do things differently. And at a certain moment, there was a fund worth in modern money about $400 million, the Boxer Indemnity Fund. And Theodore Roosevelt said, let us use this in a subtle way for American-directed reform in China. So they set up the Boxer Indemnity Scholarship Program, and they also founded what later became one of China's finest universities, Tsinghua. And so that was a very distinctive American attempt to use visible generosity, magnanimity, in a way that was very different from an imperialist Western colonial approach, but with a very clear aim that this American generosity was designed to make China different, to make China more American, more Western, more liberal. And there's a pattern there that I think for more than a century, America's leaders have said, and I think they often meant it, that they welcomed China's rise. But that welcome of China's rise had an asterisk. It was a conditional welcome. It was China was welcome to rise if it rose in ways that aligned with American values, American business interests, if it aligned with the world order, particularly after 1945, that America drafted with the other winners of World War II and then supported. You saw this when Richard Nixon was ready to visit China, although Kissinger gets a lot of the credit for deciding to open up diplomatic contacts with Chairman Mao's China. Actually, Nixon thought of it first, as Kissinger sometimes was willing to admit. There's a very interesting piece in Foreign Affairs, 1967, when Richard Nixon famously wrote, many of you probably read it, "We cannot afford to leave China forever outside the family of nations, there to nourish its fantasies and cherish its hatreds." And that was a profound insight. China was far too large to be so isolated from the rest of the world, and Nixon, as this rock-ribbed anti-communist, had the unique credentials to go to Mao and broker what eventually became recognition of China. And of course it was the right thing to do. But there was always a paternalist angle to that. If you read the same Foreign Affairs piece, Nixon compares Mao's China to the problem of juvenile delinquent gangs in America's inner cities, that they needed educating and civilizing to bring them into the community of nations. That was really a profound guide, that spirit of America not only seeking America's self-interest, but trying to, through things like the Marshall Plan, through things like the American university system around the world, that America at least aspired to be different from, say, Western European colonial powers. America was powerful enough to build an empire if it wanted to, but it didn't want to build a colonial empire. There's a fascinating moment in Kissinger's book, World Order, where he talks about going to Kansas City as an academic in 1961. He's a young academic. He goes to Kansas City to give a lecture, and he knows that the retired President Truman, the first great president of the Cold War, was living in Kansas City. So he went to see him, and he said to him, President Truman, what is the one thing that you are proudest of about your time in office? And Truman's answer, according to Kissinger, was that we totally defeated our enemies and then brought them back to the community of nations. I would like to think that only America could have done this. Now, to be sure, there was always self-interest in America's missionary view of the world that it wanted to change, bringing these former enemies, rebuilding post-war Germany, rebuilding post-war Japan with Western liberal democratic constitutions. There was clearly self-interest in the reaching out to China. That is remembered now as fundamentally about trying to take advantage of the Sino-Soviet split to bring China in as a hedge against the Soviet Union. Actually, initially, Nixon's idea was to get Chinese help to end the Vietnam War. He was already desperate to leave Vietnam, but he wanted to do it in a way that was not completely humiliating. He thought that China would help him. China actually never did. China refused to help America with the Vietnamese. And Kissinger thought that getting close to Mao, getting close to China, would actually help them get leverage with the Soviets to do a nuclear disarmament deal with the Soviets. It was only later that they realized just how frightened the Chinese were of the Soviet Union, just how deep Mao's fear was that the Soviets might actually attack, and indeed with a nuclear attack. They'd been border skirmishes. And so very quickly there was this idea that this extremely poor, extremely isolated Maoist China was the weak link in a communist bloc that America could raise up with essentially no risk, that it was so much poorer, so much more backwards in terms of technology, that America could afford to be astonishingly generous. And there's remarkable things I recommend if you're interested in the history of US-China relations. Jim Mann, great journalist, wrote a great book where he dug in and he got freedom of information requests. He got access to all of the memos and transcripts around the Kissinger meetings and then the Nixon meetings. Some of this stuff had never been seen before. Really, really fascinating, the extent to which Kissinger went way beyond his government mandate to offer things to the Chinese to try and win their confidence, including, he describes, for example, they were trying to win their trust by showing them where the Soviet military forces were, where the Chinese needed to worry about squadrons of heavy bombers from the Soviet Union that might carry nuclear weapons. And there was one moment where a top Kissinger aide spent 3 days briefing Chinese officials in the Great Hall of the People on top secret intelligence. And some of the intelligence, these satellite images of Soviet formations on the other side of the border, the Chinese didn't even realize that satellites like that existed. So there was this sense that there was no risk to giving. China was so far behind that this was a pure win for America in the 1970s. What did China want in return? Well, it wanted recognition. It wanted an end to the US recognition of Taiwan. It wanted an end to Taiwan arms sales. And if you look at those declassified transcripts, Kissinger promised far more than he was meant to. And he actually essentially said at one point to Zhou Enlai, the top diplomat under Mao, that we would understand if the historical forces basically bring Taiwan back under mainland control, and we would have no objection to that. And when he returned, and Congress and the State Department, the rest of the government, discovered what Kissinger had promised, there was quite a reaction against this. And you saw eventually Congress and the Carter administration trying to rewrite some of the terms, that initial deal that Kissinger and Nixon had made with the Chinese, to caveat it and to put in extra warnings that America would actually take Taiwan's defense very seriously. The Chinese remember that as a betrayal, that they were promised that Taiwan was theirs, that there was no particular problem with taking Taiwan. And they're not wholly wrong, although I think they vastly underestimate the fact that Taiwan became a friendly Western democracy means that clearly America's view was going to change. But you saw, not just once Mao died and once Deng Xiaoping introduced market reforms, you saw not just America, but all Western powers, the Japanese, the Europeans, determined, eager to help China rise. Part of that was self-interest. It was a place to, hopefully, to make money, to turn it into a market for goods. But initially, the trade was very, very limited, certainly for America. But there was this sense that capitalism would lead to China becoming more tractable, more like us, perhaps more liberal. There was tremendous optimism about the idea that as the party stepped back from the totalitarian control of Chairman Mao, that if you could introduce alternative forces of employment, if people didn't have to be employed by the party, if party secretaries didn't get to decide what you studied, where you worked, where you lived, who you married, that if there was a plurality of media sources, satellite television, that breaking of the party's totalitarian monopoly on Chinese minds would inevitably lead to demands for more accountable government. That as an urban middle class emerged and became more prosperous, of course they would demand more accountability and more freedom. Some of that looks now remarkably naive. So famously in the year 2000, when he was making the case for admitting China to the World Trade Organization and essentially ending the annual argument about whether China deserved preferential trade access, whether its human rights should be a barrier to giving China most favored nation status, Clinton attempted to end all of that, succeeded, by getting China into the WTO. And if you look back at the promises that Clinton made around that time, some of them look just horribly naive. There was a famous speech he gave about the rise of satellite TV, the rise of the internet, and he said, "I hear China has been trying to crack down on the internet. Good luck with that. That's sort of like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall." Well, I think China was like, okay, you give me hundreds of thousands of nails, and I'll nail that Jell-O to the wall. And in fact, China is very proud of what it's done with internet censorship. I was in Beijing last week with my editor-in-chief. We had meetings with senior officials, business leaders, and scholars. One of the officials we spoke to said, took issue when someone used the phrase the Great Firewall of China as an idea, as a description of the internet controls. No, it's not a great firewall. It is a protective shield. And it is keeping our people safe online. And much of the rest of the world admires this model and wishes to copy it. That was the message in Beijing. China's rise, the economic part of it, was far more impressive than even the optimists expected in 2001. It's hard to describe. I'm sure many of you have been to China. When I first went to China as a journalist in 1998, I'd been there as a backpacker before. When I arrived in 1998, one of the first stories I wrote about was an official visit by then Prime Minister Tony Blair of Britain. When he arrived in 1998, the British economy was larger than China and India's economies put together. When I left in 2002 and then came back in 2018 as a correspondent, between the date that I left and the date that I arrived, the Chinese economy had turned 14 times larger. And so that was an absolutely astonishing economic miracle. And at the beginning of that process, you had lots of promises made by the Americans that, as Bill Clinton said, this is a 100-0 deal for America. It's a no-brainer that America's already opened its markets to China. All the concessions will be on the Chinese side. And you saw companies piling into China, making their products there, using Chinese cheap labor, trying to sell products to Chinese consumers. And immediately there became an argument about the politics of China, but it was a very simple argument. So the first American presidential election that I covered was in 2004. And in 2004, the China argument was, who took our jobs? And so to simplify greatly, you had a container full of T-shirts that would leave a port in China, arrive at a port in the US. And you could have an argument about what had happened to the textile workers in North Carolina or another state. And the counter-argument made by the free traders, who were very dominant at this time, including the Economist, was, well, yes, some textile workers lost their jobs, but that was always going to happen. The emerging world came back. They were going to Mexico. They were going to other places. But look at how cheap things are when you go and buy a new T-shirt in the mall, at Walmart. That is a vast, diffuse value for Americans. It's keeping inflation down. And the economic impact of Chinese production was astonishing to American, it kept American inflation rates low. As China earned dollars by shipping us stuff, it had to put those dollars somewhere safe. It bought vast numbers of US treasuries. It started buying bonds in things like Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. That kept American Federal Reserve interest rates super low for a very long time. That allowed cheap and easy credit to the government, which promptly ran up deficits, to business. So there was this sense that China was part of this extraordinarily virtuous economic cycle, even if some of the losses to jobs started to look rather concentrated in certain places. But that model was still fundamentally that conditional welcome for China's rise, that welcome with an asterisk, that as long as this is still supporting American prosperity, it is making people's money go further when they go to the shops, it is helping China, it's helping keep interest rates and inflation low here in the States, we'll be fine. On balance, we're clearly the winners. And China is only competing in the low-end manufacturing. An Apple iPhone may say made in China on the back. That was the argument 20 years ago. But actually all of the value accrues, or 15 years ago, all the value accrues to Apple and its designers here in California. China's just snapping the bits together. Clearly, over the run between my 2002 departure from China and arriving in 2018, there was no doubt that something very dramatic had changed. Trump had already been elected. I'd interviewed Trump before he was president, after he was president, about China. And he clearly had a very powerful story to tell about China stealing the jobs, robbing America of its prosperity. He was tapping into very large political forces of skepticism about globalization. So what went wrong? Why did America, the country that had been so willing to, so confident of its superiority, that it was willing to be, as it saw it, very generous with China, what went wrong? The Chinese answer would be, well, we just were too successful. You never expected us to catch up. You never expected us to become a peer competitor. And you're too racist and prejudiced to tolerate a non-Western peer competitor. And that's not me guessing. That comes from private conversations with senior Chinese officials in China. That is their vision. That is their explanation for what happened. But I think it's more complicated than that. I think if we're going to examine how do we get to this point of deep disappointment and distrust, it has elements, some of them political and ideological, some of them economics, and some of them about the interplay between technology and national security. So point one, it turned out that an urban middle class did not mean that China was going to liberalize in a way that made them Western. Some of this, I think, was deeply narcissistic. There was a phrase a former senior China official in the US government has about strategic narcissism, that we base our policy on the idea that the world is inevitably trending towards America. I think you can look back at, there's a New York Times columnist, I won't name him to spare his blushes, but he wrote a column once about the rise of Western consumer goods and brands in China and how this was going to be part of the story of making China a Western-style democracy. He said, if you can when Starbucks started opening lots of outlets in China, this New York Times columnist said, there is no middle class that is content with more choices of coffee than of candidates on a ballot paper. It's a great line. It's a terrible prediction. It didn't happen. Lots of Starbucks, no democracy. So what went wrong? I think part of it is that China was not blind to what was happening in the rest of the world. The Chinese Communist Party saw the fall of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and it sent its finest scholars to go and study what had happened. Why did the Soviet Communist Party collapse? Why did the Berlin Wall fall? What did this mean for China? And to simplify, and I apologize, some of your students heard me say this before, to simplify, I think that the Chinese thought that we in the West were too excited about the fall of the Berlin Wall, meaning that everyone who had been behind the Iron Curtain wanted to live in a Jeffersonian democracy. I remember I was 18 when the Berlin Wall fell. It felt as if the world was suddenly becoming magically freer, as everyone was breathing the air of freedom. They longed for freedom, and many of them clearly did. That was clearly true. I remember Polish students turning up at college and talking about how they never imagined they could travel around Europe, and it was incredibly moving. I'm sure many of you remember that. But the Chinese studied it, and I think this is my phrase, not theirs, that they concluded that quite a lot of people behind the Iron Curtain, what they really wanted was Volkswagens and bananas and foreign holidays. And that if you gave them those, you might not need to give them democracy or free speech or a free press. And that bet worked out pretty well for the Chinese Communist Party because they could always buttress the demands for more accountability with, what are you worried about? You're worried about air pollution and water pollution? Okay, we'll tackle those. The technocrats will tackle the demands of the Chinese public where they're challenging bad policy. And so, performance legitimacy is the term that political scientists will talk about. A government doesn't necessarily have to get elected in a competitive election if it can demonstrate that it is responsible for remarkable economic growth and better policy. And that performance legitimacy was China's big bet. And that was a big shock to that American strategy, that making China richer and more prosperous was going to inevitably lead to something much more like America. And then I think the role of technology and national security is incredibly important. In addition to that row about the jobs, where do the jobs go? I think we have, the backlash against globalization has grown and grown and grown because we've discovered that in politics, the concentrated losses of globalization have far more weight than the diffuse benefits of people getting cheap stuff at Walmart. But also, one of the things that I've spent a lot of time studying since I arrived back in China is the role of technology. So if in 2004, the row was about that container of T-shirts crossing the sea, now China, absolutely understandably, as a highly advanced engineering country with millions of engineering graduates every year with lots of universities, has decided it wants to do more than just make cheap stuff. It wants to be more than the workshop of the world. It wants to be responsible for dominating the high-tech sectors of the 21st century. Of course they do. We shouldn't be shocked by that. We may not welcome it. Some of it we may, some of it we may not. But it's absolutely inevitable that as China rose up the value chain, it was going to want to make the most valuable technologies of the future. But where are we with these technologies? Where is the best value added in modern economics? Well, it's things that are not quite goods, like a box of T-shirts. They're not quite services, like an insurance policy. They're a hybrid. A lot of the most valuable commodities and products and services are, to take an example, the Internet of Things, cloud data services, TikTok, medical devices which are connected that know when you're going to have a heart attack before you do, autonomous vehicles or partly autonomous vehicles filled with cameras and sensors that know what you're saying, where you're going, who's in your car, and all of that data is improving the algorithm every time that you drive that car. That's the business model. American, aircraft manufacturers, if you look at the business model of a company that makes airplane engines, they actually lease the engines, they're filled with sensors. The model is that as the plane lands, there's an engineer waiting to fix the fault that the sensor has already told the company needs fixing. It's a hybrid good and service. That's where the value added is. Now, all of these things are remarkably successful technologies, but all of them require deep trust between the producer and the consumer, because that car knows who was in your car last night. It knows where you went, what you said. It knows whether you're going to have a heart attack before you do. It knows what is in your data. And it turns out that it matters enormously where the data center is, who has that data, what they're using that algorithm for. And so much the most advanced globalization in the 21st century involves a lifetime commitment of trust between a company and a consumer. And China wants to dominate those sectors just as ideological trust is falling off a cliff. And that's a real problem. It's an unprecedented problem. We have never tried to be economically interdependent with a country that is absolutely, unashamedly not going to align with our political model, that indeed says its model of censorship and social control and authoritarian rule is superior, that it's better than our chaotic, decadent, democratic system. We didn't ask the Soviet Union to build our telephone exchanges, but China wants to build our 5G networks and our data services. And it turns out that that is really, really hard to fix. If you think back to the panic that Japan caused in the 1980s when its deficit in goods with America, or its surplus in goods, Japan's surplus, went up tenfold in a decade. What did you see? You saw a protectionist panic. In America, you saw Congress demanding trade quotas, managed trade. You saw the Plaza Accord, where Japan and others were forced to revalue their currencies to suit America. Japan did all of that because it was a dependent military ally of the United States. It was an ideological ally. At the same time, in the 1980s, the USSR, the terrifying ideological threat, barely traded with America. In 1987, a couple of years before the fall of the Berlin Wall, total two-way trade between the USA and the USSR was $2 billion in a year. It was a bit of wood, a bit of coal, a bit of wheat, some machinery. Today, two-way trade between China and the United States, even if it's dropped substantially since Trump's first term, is about $2 billion a day. So not $2 billion a year, Soviet-US trade, $2 billion a day. That's nominal numbers, but still an absolutely enormous increase. So I think one way to see how the mood in Washington has been over the last few years is that when you look at China, you think of it as Japan and the Soviet Union all rolled into one. It's this mono threat. And that is profoundly shocking to American politics, that idea that America had nothing to fear from China catching up. There's a real problem that Chinese multinationals now have as they come out into the world, which is an understandable ambition, because that question about what does it mean to have a Chinese government behind, what does it mean to have a Chinese parent company, is extremely painful to the idea of the multinational corporation. One of the pillars of modern globalization is the idea that it's not very important where the parent company is located, that it doesn't matter if it's German or Dutch or Danish or Canadian or Australian or Japanese, that these are multinational corporations. But I think in the most recent years, there is no confidence that a Chinese multinational corporation is a phrase that means anything, that they are all ultimately at some level controlled by the Communist Party of China. Now, you can clearly take that much too far. There are politicians I've interviewed on Capitol Hill who tell me there is no such thing as a private company in China. And that's nonsense. There are clearly private companies in China that would like to have as little to do with the Communist Party as they can. But under Xi Jinping, in recent years, you may not be interested in the Communist Party, but the Communist Party is interested in you. And company after company has got into trouble because their claim to be trustworthy in the West rests not on could we do this, is it imaginable that we would do this, so much as a promise that we may do this thing in China, but we would certainly not do it here. So look at the TikTok debate. The TikTok debate is really interesting because on one level, you can say it's ridiculous. TikTok is, cat videos and makeup videos and influencers. How can it matter that this thing is on our kids' smartphones, on our apps? But you're into this question about capability versus intention. Because if the question on the exam paper is, would it be possible to construct a short video platform that looks exactly like TikTok, that censors itself in line with Chinese Communist Party censorship, and that delivers Chinese Communist propaganda, and that harvests data from its users and sends that to the Chinese security system, if that's the question on the exam paper, the answer is yes. It's called Douyin. It's the Chinese version of TikTok, and it's owned by the same company. And it does all of those things in China, because that's Chinese law. And so TikTok is now obliged to say, well, we may do all of those things in China, but we certainly would never do them here. Because look, we have a legal contract that says we wouldn't. But you can't see the algorithm because the algorithm is the business model. And that's a black box. And so you then have Congress passing this law by unanimity that TikTok must sell the algorithm. The Chinese government immediately says, well, we're not sure that we can allow that to happen. Maybe that's a challenge to Chinese vested interests. Well, that's quite a painful moment for TikTok, because if you're just an American company with a Singapore CEO, why is the Chinese government saying that you may not be allowed to sell the algorithm? You're seeing this at the moment there's many nonsense things about Donald Trump's arguments about Panama, many. And his claims that the Chinese Communist Party or the Chinese PLA controls the Panama Canal is clearly nonsense. But once again, the Chinese government is not making life easy for Chinese private business, because the row, as you know, really turns on. There are two ports close to the ends of the Panama Canal, and they're both owned by a Hong Kong company, Hutchison, owned by one of the richest men in Hong Kong and China, Li Ka-shing. He offers to sell those ports, along with a total of 43 ports, to an American-led consortium. What does China say? China is now saying, no, if an American company owns those ports, they might get control of the Panama Canal. They might be able to block Chinese shipping. Well, hang on. When I was in Beijing, any number of Chinese officials would say to me, how dare you panic about Chinese ports around the world? That doesn't offer any control at all. Well, you can't have both, right? Huawei's pitch, I interviewed the head of Huawei back in 2019 when there was a moment when they were trying to open up to the world, and his pitch was, we are a private company, we're not controlled by the Chinese government or the Chinese Communist Party, and when we're in a country like the UK, we'll just obey local laws. That's what we do. And I think it's true that it's a private company. You only have to go to their weird campus in Shenzhen with this kind of mock French chateau and the Bavarian Schloss and his office, which has a bronze hippo in a ballerina dress and a model of the Parthenon inside. It's a very weird. It's not a Communist Party office. Trust me. But here's the problem: when Huawei starts to offer to build 5G networks for Western governments around the world, in Europe, and European governments are unsure about the national security implications of that. And it becomes an argument really between the tech nerds who say, well, we can't find a backdoor in the box. And the British case is fascinating. So there are two intelligence agencies that looked into Huawei building 5G. There's our equivalent of the NSA, it's called GCHQ. And they say, well, we looked in the box, we can't find a backdoor in the box. We think it's okay. But our equivalent of the CIA, MI6, said, well, why would you let a country like China build something as vital as a 5G network? What if there was a war over Taiwan and China just stopped the updates and just brought down the 5G network? What would that do to life in a country like the UK? And the problem was for Huawei, and I feel sorry for Chinese multinationals, that in country after country around Europe, as Huawei got into trouble, the Chinese ambassador would turn up in the office of the relevant government minister in Denmark or the Netherlands and say, if you don't put Huawei in your 5G network, your entire relationship with China will be toast. Well, the problem with that, if Huawei is a private company, then why is the Chinese ambassador in my office shouting at me? And so you can see that for Chinese tech companies that have this absolutely natural ambition to be at the top of the value chain in the 21st century, the one thing worse than having the Chinese Communist Party come after you is having the Chinese Communist Party try to help you. It didn't just begin with Trump either. One of the lines you hear in Beijing all the time is that all of this is down to Donald Trump because he's this insane China hawk. No, I was in Washington as the bureau chief in the second term of Barack Obama. The breakdown of trust happened in the second Obama term. There were some core promises that the Obama administration felt that it had secured from Xi Jinping, a promise not to militarize reefs in the South China Sea, made in public in the Rose Garden at the White House, also not to use espionage to harvest technology and give it to companies for profit. And both of those promises were broken. There's a whole bunch of people in the Biden administration who are basically what I called not China hawks so much as broken-hearted ex-China doves, people who had believed in engagement and then felt that China had proved itself untrustworthy. And so what happened in the first term of Donald Trump and during the Biden administration, I think, is that if you remember that opening idea of American presidents welcoming China's rise with an asterisk, that conditional welcome for China's rise, I think around the Trump first administration and Biden, that became a selective welcome for China's rise. That China's rise was clearly a challenge. It was not involving alignment with American values, and therefore some technologies, particularly a technology that might get into the hands of the Chinese military, had to be blocked. That America still had the power to choke off certain forms of the software that writes the designs for semiconductors, some of the other very, very advanced technologies, the most high-end semiconductors, and that America needed to choke off that supply. The Chinese scholars that I was talking to at the time were absolutely incensed by this American approach. Biden was a huge disappointment to them. They thought that they knew him. He'd come to China a lot as vice president. They couldn't understand why the tariffs had not gone away, why the export controls were becoming tougher. I remember a prominent Chinese scholar, one of the people who's on track 2 dialogues, trying to reach out to the Trump 2 administration right now, said at a dinner 2 years ago with my big boss and me in Beijing, he said, the Americans want us to be a big, fat pussycat that makes unthreatening consumer goods. But we want to be a tiger. But America is determined that when we develop an AI fang, you're going to pull it out. If we develop a quantum fang, you're going to pull it out. Well, we don't want to be defanged. We don't want to be a pussycat. And that resentment, that sense that China was finally getting back to the top table in the global order is totally understandable. But the American argument that I was hearing from senior Biden officials was also pretty coherent, which was, we have spent 30 years helping China get stronger with our money and our technology. And we think that we can't control that technology ending up in the hands of the Chinese military, which appears to be rearming in a way that is explicitly designed to fight the American military and keep us out of Asia. So why would we help the PLA kill American soldiers and sailors with our money and our technology? And that's also a completely reasonable objection to the old version of engagement. So for me, the reason, as we ended the Biden administration, that US-China relations were so hard is that both sides had a perfectly coherent argument. This was a clash of intelligible but mutually intolerable ambitions. And we don't know how to fix that because it's zero-sum. It's winner takes all. One side is going to lose this. Back in 2018, I wrote a special report for The Economist on US-China relations, and I asked all the smartest people I knew in China and in Washington who did China stuff, how does this end well? What's a good ending to this? And what was very striking was that there was a complete consensus in each city, Beijing and Washington. In Beijing, the consensus was, this ends well when America sucks it up. That's not literally what they said, but that was the meaning. That America realizes it's lost, that China is now a peer competitor, that it is so powerful that China will not be told what to do by America. And then America will have to get over itself and will have to accommodate China. And in Washington, when I asked the smartest China people, people who'd worked for Obama, people who'd worked for Bush, how does this end well? They said, China stumbles. China makes so many sort of unforced errors. Its statist system, its increased censorship and repression chokes off innovation. And that slower growing, less successful China, maybe with a different leader after Xi Jinping leaves the stage, is kind of apologetically willing to come back and deal with us in a more reasonable way. Well, what does that tell you? It tells you that the best case scenario on each side was completely mutually exclusive and intolerable to the other power. America had no desire to accommodate China, hand it Taiwan in those ways. China had no desire to stumble and fail if that's the only way out. So then we end up Trump 2 coming back. So I was just in Washington a month ago. I'm going to Washington again tomorrow to talk to people, including about China. I was in Beijing last week. I think and I was Washington bureau chief for the first 2 years of Trump. I think Trump 1 was an extraordinarily significant election victory. I think Trump 2 is revolutionary. It is absolutely different. In Trump 1, the grown-ups, the people that he appointed because he wasn't experienced in government, Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State, people like Jim Mattis as Secretary of Defense, some of his other advisors, Gary Cohn in economics, they slowed him down. Trump 2, his top aides are speeding him up. He's chosen loyalists, people with his same worldview. And when it comes to US-China, we don't know how that ends because there's two Donald Trumps. There's the Donald Trump who says fantastically rude things about China on the campaign trail, who says that China has raped America's national wealth. He's going to break China. But there's also the Donald Trump who says he's not sure that we need to sell TikTok. China needs to sell TikTok. He's looked at it, can't see the problem. TikTok, a lot of followers voted for him at the election. Looks good to me. Why would we do that? He's about to break a law that Congress passed, forcing the divestiture of the TikTok algorithm, we think. That seems to be where he's going. He has made it very clear that he thinks that China could potentially be a partner in a deal. He said China could be very helpful in Ukraine. He said that Xi Jinping is a very smart man who rules China with an iron fist, 1.4 billion people, but that's what he could do in a country like that. He told Xi Jinping, we know from the memoirs of John Bolton, his former national security advisor, in the first term, behind closed doors, he said to Xi Jinping, you are right to lock up the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. In fact, a friend of mine in the government told me that the second half of the sentence, which isn't in Bolton's book, is, and if the British did the same to their Muslims, they'd have fewer problems. But that's the same Donald Trump who hires extremely serious China hawks, Matt Pottinger in the National Security Council, Mike Pompeo as his final Secretary of State, people who declare that what is happening in Xinjiang is a genocide at the end of the first term of Trump, people who impose incredibly strict export controls, tariffs designed to force China to to change its business model. So which Trump is the real Trump? Which Trump will we see in Trump 2? Well, I don't think we know. And I think one thing that I have, after talking to a lot of people, I think that our analysis of Trump 1 and his China policy, his defenders in Washington will tell you that look at the policies, not what he says. Take what he does seriously, not what he says. His actions, not his words. I don't think that's good analysis, because the argument is that somehow, yes, he said all those awful things about, he doesn't have an interest in the Hong Kong democracy process in 2019, doesn't care about Tibet, doesn't care about Xinjiang, says that Taiwan stole our semiconductor industry, that it should pay more for its security, that he doesn't guarantee to help Taiwan. All of those words we're told to ignore, because at the end of the Trump administration, he delivered very tough policies, the toughest China policies we've seen. But I'm not sure that's the right model. I don't believe that Donald Trump is himself a China hawk. If China hawk means someone who disapproves of China's political system, China's authoritarianism, China's subsidized industrial policies, he thinks all of that is smart. Protectionism, he thinks that's smart. He thinks free trade is the dumb stuff. He says that China was smart to take all of those American jobs. He just wants them to reverse the flow. I think that one way to think of Donald Trump is that as a real estate developer, he thinks of the American economy as the most valuable piece of real estate in the world, and he just wants China to pay more. He's having a rent review. He thinks that foreigners should pay rent to access the American economy, and China wasn't paying enough rent. So as he's done many times in his career, he's having an aggressive rent review. If you look at the pressure for a trade deal in the first term, there were two very different trade deals in play at the same time. There was a fairly simple trade deal, phase 1, that involved China just buying tons and tons of soybeans and other American products. And then there was another trade deal, phase 2, which was the brainchild of his then USTR, his trade representative, Bob Lighthizer. Now, Robert Lighthizer was a trade lawyer who cut his teeth back in the days of the Japan trade panic. He, as a young lawyer, worked on things like managed trade, quotas imposed on Japanese cars and motorcycles. He came back to the White House determined to pull off the same sort of deal. If you look at his tariffs that he had designed months into the first Trump administration under a piece of American trade law, Section 301, it's basically designed to look at all of the high-tech sectors that China had identified as the sectors of the 21st century, things like robotics, biotechnologies, and others, AI. All of the sectors that China listed in a document called Made in China 2025. Robert Lighthizer took Made in China 2025, China's own industrial policy, as the blueprint for the tariffs, electric vehicles, robotics, biotech, aviation, and designed to hit them with tariffs to try and hold China down, to break its business model. This time around, Lighthizer is not in the administration. There's various reasons why that may be, but there is a real debate about whether Donald Trump wants to have phase 1 and phase 2, the simple purchases agreement, or does he actually still have an interest in trying to change the way that China runs its economy, that it runs its system? I suspect the evidence is very limited for the latter. I spoke to someone who's now in a senior position in the Trump administration now, who said to me, we don't need to break China. We don't need to limit China. We're certainly not under any illusion that we're going to change China. We just need Chinese stuff to get more expensive so that Americans can be hired to make things in factories. And so if that's where we're going, then what happens to the China hawks? How do we understand the role of the China hawks, who once again he's hired? His Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, his National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz. These are all conventional China hawks. The Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, just in Asia last week, saying extremely familiar conventional things about we're here to defend our allies. Japan is a great ally against Chinese communist aggression. The Philippines, we will stand by the Philippines in their territorial disputes with China. If China attacks Filipino supply ships in the South China Sea, America will feel that its defense treaty with the Philippines is invoked. All incredibly familiar, hawkish China policy stuff. But in the first term, that coexisted with a Trump who didn't seem personally to believe in these things. And I think the best explanation for the first term that I've heard from someone inside the system is you need to understand Donald Trump, when he hires these hawks, it's not that he wants them to change his mind or shape his views or give him policies. It's like going into court as a businessman with the toughest lawyers in New York. They're there because they're leg breakers, they are knee breakers, that's their job. But as long as there might be a deal to be done, Donald Trump is willing to trade almost anything And we saw this in the talks with the North Korean dictator in the first term. But when it became clear that there was not a deal to be done, that there was not going to be a grand bargain between America and North Korea, then he loses interest and he hands it off to his aides and he gives it to the knee breakers who break knees. That's what knee breakers do. And I think we could see that same pattern in the second term. We don't know. I was just in Beijing. Scholars cannot decide. Is China going to face the same as the first term, but just a bit more aggressively? Or is something really different and radical happening involving American retreat from the whole world? To put it in really simple terms, what does Trump's willingness to cut a bad deal in Ukraine mean for Asian allies? If you're Taiwan, one scholar in Shanghai said to me, the Taiwanese should be terrified by what's happening to Ukraine. Clearly, Donald Trump is not going to come and save Taiwan. He doesn't care about his allies. He wants to cut a good deal for Vladimir Putin. Now, that's one scenario. There's another camp that says, no, when he's finished with Europe, when he's limited America's security presence in Europe, it's clearly in order to pivot to Asia, to contain China. And there's evidence for that. We have Marco Rubio saying it's about focusing all his efforts on China. We have Pete Hegseth saying it's about focusing all his efforts on China. And that means alliances in Asia. But there's also, inside the administration, evidence that the support for allies in Asia is actually really fragile, that it doesn't align with Donald Trump's views, that he is not particularly fussed about Taiwan's fate. Again, we know that in the first term in private, he was extremely dismissive of Taiwan's views. And so the Chinese are waiting to see if they might be able to offer a deal where they help with fentanyl, where they don't challenge the supremacy of the US dollar, but in exchange, and they buy a ton of Chinese, American soybeans, but in exchange, they would like some language on Taiwan, saying that that America opposes Taiwan independence, or that America does not disapprove of the peaceful reunification of Taiwan. And I think we don't know which way Donald Trump will go on that, because there are people close to him going into senior positions who said that, frankly, Taiwan is not a vital national interest for the United States. It's important, but not a vital national interest. So I think in this second term, if we ended the Biden administration with these mutually intolerable ambitions, where there was a very clear, rational view of the role of technology, the role of security, the role of globalization, I think everything is back up in the air in Trump too. We know that China is the focus of tremendous efforts by some people in the Trump administration. We saw the tariff announcement in the Rose Garden. The cumulative tariffs now on China are 54%. That's an astonishingly high rate. And even though China is prepared for this, that's dangerous. We've seen tougher export controls. But there's another Trump who wants China to play a role in the Ukraine endgame, who's not sure that you need to sell TikTok, who clearly is open to some sort of deal. And if Donald Trump turns out to be more of an isolationist than a prioritizer, if he's actually going to ditch the Asian allies along with the European allies, then there are leading figures in China who see a tremendous opportunity for China, that countries in Asia will start to hedge if they realize that America isn't actually willing to pick a fight in Asia to defend the Filipinos or to defend Taiwan. This is an amazing opportunity. And so I don't think we have a clue what Donald Trump's China policy is going to look like. And anyone who tells you they do is not being straight with you. But we do know what China's plan is. Xi Jinping used to say in public that the East is rising and the West is in decline. He doesn't say that in public anymore. But I think there's all evidence that he still believes that. Now he has this phrase about 百年变局, changes unseen in 100 years. And he said on camera with Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin last year, there are changes unseen in 100 years and you and I will drive them together. I think he sees an opportunity that a declining, decadent West is falling apart, that Trump is destroying Western unity, alienating allies. And China has developed high technologies that are not dependent on American chokehold technologies, in the phrase they use, that the DeepSeek AI model survived despite the attempts to deny them the highest end NVIDIA chips. So we don't know what Donald Trump's plan is. I think we genuinely don't know. But China has a plan, and China plans to win.
So much, David. We have plenty of time for questions. If you could please go to the mic in the center to ask your questions, and I think we'll take questions 2 or 3 at a time. So, who would like to? Okay, we have. So please just follow up online as your questions come.
Hi, thank you for your speech. It was really good. It was a great lecture. I actually have a question about the EU's role in all of this. So from my perspective, I see the EU having globally a lot stronger commitment to human rights than the United States, but far less security commitments in East Asia. So now with the US sort of withdrawing from Europe and sort of the EU scrambling in a lot of senses, where does the EU move forward with China? Are they gonna, be hardliners about human rights, or are they more amenable to having a potential ally against a threat like Russia?
Thank you. Is there another question, or shall I answer that?
Is there another question, Kevin?
We can take a couple at a time if you want.
Hi, thank you. That one's really interesting lecture. I was just wondering, what is our biggest misconception about China, would you say, that we misunderstand here in the States and in Europe as well? Thank you.
Hi, love the speech. As someone from China who's wishing to be a journalist and practicing in China, I'm wondering, I know you spent like years in China, and obviously like Chinese nationals face more like limitations compared to like foreign journalists.
Mm-hmm.
But what advice would you give to someone who wishes to practice journalism in China, just based on your experience dealing with like local journalists?
Thank you. So those are all fantastic questions. So Europe broke ground that then the Biden administration followed some years ago, where they came up with this tripod view of how to view their relations with China. They said China is a partner for cooperation. They meant things like climate change, global public health. It's a commercial competitor, and it's a systemic rival. That was getting into the ideological challenge that Chinese human rights or Chinese ambitions in its region hold for Europe and for the West. Now, the Chinese government absolutely loathes the systemic rival part. They really reject that. But it actually is a pretty good description of how European governments have come to see China. And I think during the Ukraine war, I saw myself a real change in the views of European ambassadors in Beijing, for example. I was in Beijing for the whole of the Ukraine war at the beginning, because as it became clear that the Chinese were absolutely indispensable suppliers of dual-use goods that were going into the Russian arms industry to make tanks and missiles and drones that were packed with components making the American sanctions unable to limit Putin's war machine, this became a really serious issue for European governments that they would raise with senior Chinese officials at every opportunity. And so I've heard a senior European official about a year ago say, it's not just the 3 legs of partner, commercial competitor, systemic rival, it's also national security threat. There was also Chinese intelligence agencies have been hacking into Western infrastructure, planting malware, scoping out power systems, scoping out dams, scoping out water suppliers, utilities in America, in Europe. You talk to people from Western intelligence agencies, they'll say everyone spies, we spy, they spy, but what they're doing is just another level. It's just extremely concerning because it's involving infrastructure. If you want to be paranoid, it looks like preparations for turning off our utilities in a potential war, and that's very concerning. Now where do we stand? Well, Europe is reeling, really, absolutely stunned by what is happening over Ukraine, Trump's blaming of Ukraine for the war, blaming of NATO for the war, his understanding of Vladimir Putin's arguments, his repeating of Vladimir Putin's talking points. There is a suspicion, a real fear, that not only is he about to impose a bad deal on Ukraine to get a quick peace deal, but the worst case scenario, the nightmare that European governments hope is not true, is that actually Russia is the country that Trump favors, that America is changing sides, that actually he aligns with the conservative social values and the autocratic ways of Vladimir Putin in a way that he does not have any respect for the European Union. That may or may not turn out to be the case, but that is the fear. And so now in Europe, there's this real sense of, if we can't depend on America, if America's just hit the European Union with 25% tariffs, for as far as we can tell, no good reason at all. If Donald Trump is telling us that the European Union was created as a project to screw America, that's his own words, which is just not historically accurate. America created the European Union for its own Cold War interests. what do we need to do about China? And there are voices, I heard them in Beijing last week, saying, okay, that leg about systemic rival, maybe it's a luxury now. You know, human rights, talking about Uyghurs in Xinjiang, challenging China in the South China Sea. Who knows? I mean, if the Americans leave Taiwan, one ambassador said to me, if the Americans are not willing to defend Taiwan, we have no fantasies that we're about to. You know, we sail the odd frigate through the Taiwan Straits from European governments, but we're not about to defend Taiwan if America doesn't. And there are people in Europe saying, we need to hedge. We need to give ourselves options. We need to deepen our trade. Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, who had been absolutely hawkish on China, saying that Europe needed to de-risk in order not to have to decouple, that meant eliminating dangerous dependencies on China for important supply chains, important components. She's now talking about we need to deepen our trade, we need to deepen our engagement. We're in a time of utterly transactional geopolitics and policy. That's clearly a reference to Trump, although she's an Atlanticist. She used to be one of the leading Atlanticists in Brussels. And so I think there is a desire to massively tone down the ideological side of the relationship with China. But here's the problem. The Chinese industrial model, the export-led growth, China's incredibly subsidized industrial production, if that is shut out of American markets by American tariffs, the only other rich world market of any size that will still be open is Europe. And European governments are absolutely terrified that this fire hose of Chinese exports will be directed into European markets and destroy extraordinary numbers of jobs. So if you want a prediction for the next 12 months, I think that we'll see far less talk about ideology in the relationship between many Western countries and China. It's a bad time to be a Uyghur. It's a bad time to be a democratic activist somewhere like Hong Kong. It's probably a scary time to be Taiwan. But does that mean that relations will be smooth? No, I think that we're going to see potentially enormous trade rows between the Europeans and the Chinese, even as they're terrified of the pressure from America and the tariffs. Because although China talks a very good game about being open to foreign investment, about being the defender of the rules-based order, the WTO, China is also a very ruthless, subsidized player that is flooding Western markets with goods way below production price in some sectors and has already destroyed some important sectors in the European economy. And if that's next cars, then that's a giant problem. And here's a specific thing that I think we'll see play out over the next year or two. If you think back to what I was saying about Japan in the 1980s, one of the ways that Japan fixed its trade fight with the Americans was a good thing. Toyota and other Japanese car companies opened plants here in the US, and they fundamentally improved American car making. All of the American car makers were made better by the techniques of the Japanese car companies. I'm not sure, it's an open question, whether China is welcome to open those plants here in America. Most Republicans in Congress say absolutely not. We've seen in Michigan, in Virginia, Republican governors saying that things like Chinese battery plants are not welcome in America. Donald Trump on the campaign trail said that he would welcome Chinese investment if it creates jobs making cars in America. So again, we don't exactly know where Trump is. But here's the problem for Europe. Right now, European car makers are way behind on things like EVs, battery-led EVs, because they were just slow, because they were so good at making the old-style cars that they were complacent. The Chinese were never very good at making internal combustion engine cars, so they decided to focus on EVs and batteries, and they've now become utterly dominant in those technologies. Most European governments that I have spoken to, their desire is for China to open factories inside Europe, within Europe's tariff barriers, but to make them real jobs. They don't just want to, as one European official said to me in Brussels the other day, the problem is that the Chinese car makers, they want to sell us these snap-together kits. He said, it's like buying a wardrobe from IKEA. They give you a screwdriver and you get to put it together. But those aren't manufacturing jobs. We need to do the same to China that China did to us 30 years ago. 30 years ago, to get into the Chinese market as a car maker or another Western company, you had to form a joint venture. You had to train Chinese engineers. You had to transfer all of the technology. And then eventually, China got to compete, certainly in sectors like high-speed trains. The Europeans that I've been speaking to, senior officials, will say, China taught us a lesson. That's how you do it when you're ruthless. If they want to come into our market, which is the most valuable open market in the world, they're going to have to transfer technology and form joint ventures, come inside our tariff walls. The problem is that for the moment, the Chinese government believes that it has more market power than Europe and that Europe is under attack from Trump. And so China is currently refusing to transfer technology and is forbidding Chinese companies like BYD and Geely to transfer technology when it opens plants in Europe. And in fact, China's been threatening governments like the Spanish government, whose prime minister was told, if you vote for the EV tariffs at the European Council, we will cancel our investments to build a BYD factory and a battery factory in Spain. As one senior European said to me a couple of weeks ago, the Chinese tell us they want a much better relationship with Europe. They say, Donald Trump is here and he's terrifying, so he needs to be our friend. They want a better relationship, but the problem is they want it for free. They don't want to make any changes to their industrial model. So we don't know how this ends. So my short version, that was not a short answer, but my short answer is the ideological part, the human rights part, is about to become much, much less evident, I think. But the economic competition is actually really, really problematic. Our biggest misconception about China, I'll try and be brief, and I think one of them in America is this idea that China is a totalitarian state where everyone hates the Communist Party and is kind of living in terror of their leaders, and if only they had a moment of freedom, they would speak out and say how much they hate Xi Jinping. Now, I have plenty of problems with the Chinese Communist Party and the way that they run China. It is a dictatorship. It is not a free society. There's a lot of repression. But I think if you're going to engage with China, you need to know that a lot of Chinese people are basically more focused on the economic development and the progress and the modernity and the ability to travel, the Volkswagens and bananas and foreign holidays. China has delivered that, performance legitimacy is a powerful thing, and that the Chinese economy has basically life for, almost anyone you meet in China. If you ask them, do you have a better life than your parents? It's kind of 100% yes, of course. Look at what we have. Look at what we can eat. Look at what we buy. Look at the car I drive. Look at my apartment. There's much less consensus. Do you think your children will have a better life than you? There's more doubt about that. There's plenty of concerns in China about the direction of the economy, about the support for the public sector. If you're an entrepreneur, a lot of nervousness. There are liberal Chinese, they're a minority, but they're there, who are certainly concerned about the repression. There are older Chinese who remember the Mao years and the personality cults and the centralization and personalization of power. Some of the stuff around Xi Jinping, they say that feels dangerously familiar to them. They're very unhappy. So that's certainly part of it. But I think that the Chinese Communist Party operates in a system which has never known free democratic elections. So for thousands of years, the Chinese people, authority was the emperor, it was the ruler, and now it's the new emperor, it's the new ruler. One of the real fascinating changes I've seen in my time in China is when I was first there in the 90s, the Chinese Communist Party could not say enough bad things about the last imperial dynasty, the Qing. They were the feudal, kind of decadent feudal Qing who had allowed the foreigners to bully China. Now, the greatest empire-building emperors of the 18th century Qing, people like the Emperor Qianlong or Yongzheng, Kangxi, they're now claimed as national heroes who worked hard as statesmen like Xi Jinping. The Communist Party now says that it is the worthy inheritor of all that is great about 5,000 years of Chinese civilization, that it has sinicized and synthesized traditional Chinese values and culture with the best of Marxism and created this new perfect blend. It's a remarkable moment, and I think that that civilizational claim for legitimacy is very powerful. I think for a lot of Chinese people, and again, it's a country of 1.4 billion people, so you can't generalize, and I don't know, people in the audience, if they're from China, will disagree with me potentially, but I think one way to understand the way that the Communist Party is viewed by a lot of Chinese, not all Chinese, is it's a bit like your parents or your teacher. They're just the thing that runs the world. They are the people in charge. And you may dislike your parents, you may be angry with your parents, but you don't want to be an orphan. And so the Communist Party has done a fantastic job of saying, there's this, actually it's a song, 没有共产党就没有新中国. There is no Communist Party, there is no new China. Without the Communist Party, there is only humiliation and division and being bullied by foreigners and a howling void of disorder and chaos. And a lot of Chinese remember poverty and chaos. And so that's quite a powerful argument. Now, that does not mean that I'm going to resile from thinking that China should be a lot less repressive, that things have got a lot worse. In my 25 years of working in China, for sure the repression is worse, but I think we need to not imagine that that strategic narcissism of thinking that the world trends towards us and that as soon as you have a Starbucks, you're going to want a multi-party democracy. I think that is a major mistake if we guide our policy with that. Chinese journalism, I knew some fantastic Chinese journalists, some of them working for Chinese media outlets in the 1990s as investigative journalists. They did really impressive work that helped us do our jobs, breaking scandals about pollution and corruption in China, often at quite a lot of risk to their own careers. Most of those brave Chinese investigative journalists have left journalism now. It's very often, you meet the PR person for some big Chinese tech company and they'll tell you they used to be a journalist. But it's very hard to be a Chinese journalist now. The controls on Chinese state journalists are much, much stricter, much more political. The role of Chinese journalism, I was told in Beijing last week with my boss by a senior Chinese official, journalism in China is there to give the people hope. They're there to explain the government's policies. And you in the West, you need to learn to give governments credit when they do good things. That is the role of Chinese journalists. And that is clearly the role of Chinese journalists. Now, there are also very brave Chinese journalists, a much smaller number, who work with people like us, The Economist. We have Chinese news assistants who are Chinese nationals. They are not allowed by law to write anything for us, but they're invaluable partners in terms of telling us what we should be writing, telling us this is what's being talked about, this is what's creating a buzz. You ask them to help you find, if I want to write about this, where should I go, what should we do? When you go there, I was absolutely clear with our Chinese assistants in the office, read my piece before I send it to London. Do you recognize this country that I'm describing? Of course I'm describing it in an economist way. I'm an economist journalist, I'm a Western liberal, but do you recognize this country? Am I just getting it wrong? And they would often say, no, that's not how we see it. That's not how we think of this. You need to tweak this. So there is a role for journalism, but that idea of journalism as a check and a balance that was there in the late 90s, there in the early 2000s, in quite a powerful way, I'm afraid there's very little room for that now in modern China.
All right, maybe two more questions? Okay. Oh, boy.
Thank you so much for your talk. Can you share your insights and predictions on China's plan toward Africa or Latin America, given that those are the areas where there seems to be less resistance toward China's influence? What does it mean to the U.S., especially from a resource-based perspective? Thank you.
What you were saying kind of reminded me of a quote from Kaiser Kuo, who I know spoke here a couple years ago. He said, in a world full of states, China wants to be a civilization. How do you think this kind of ideology or way of thinking, how do you think China is going to use this to approach domestic and foreign policy kind of going forward? And how have they used that in the past?
So referring to that, you said we don't particularly see a way out in the U.S.-China relations right now because China has no intention to ally with the U.S. ideology and does not plan to stumble on their development. And you've also said that Trump is not a traditional China hawk. And something I've been observing is that it's not just Chairman Xi that's being compared to Chairman Mao. It's also Trump. So columnists are making comments that Trump is somewhat like Chairman Mao because of he's tearing down the federal government and the populism implication of his electoral victory to the U.S. So I'm trying to ask that, like, in this time where U.S. is also facing a transition that you're deviating from the conventional political norms, do you actually see that there is a way out from that?
Thank you. Great question. Thank you.
I think we'll have to leave it there. Yeah.
Shall I take one more? I'll be quick. No.
Oh, up to
We have someone at the microphone.
Okay.
Seems I can be quick. Yeah.
Hello. You mentioned several times about in your lecture about how Taiwan is in a very precarious position right now. From your experience dealing with the higher ups in China, do you think that China is planning to invade Taiwan within the next 4 years?
Thank you. Small one. Yeah. Okay. So China in the global south is a fascinating question. Clearly, there is an opportunity as America scraps USAID, pulls out of things like fighting HIV in Africa. China, all over Latin America, buying up tremendous amounts of resources. Look, some of that America is going to find hard to compete with. China needs soybeans and oil and gas. America doesn't. America makes its own soybeans and oil and gas. So there is a competition that America isn't going to win, which is that China is resource poor with a large manufacturing sector. America has all the resources of its own that it needs, so it's not going to compete. And down in Latin America, some of the most conservative figures, big agricultural interests, are very pro-China. I was down in Argentina recently talking to the head of the Sociedad Rural Argentina, which is like this 19th century kind of landowners kind of trade group. And he said, whatever we produce, whether it's beef or soybeans, the Chinese will buy from us. Es un barril sin fondo. It's a barrel with no bottom. So that's hard to compete with. And yes, in geopolitical terms, I think that is quite a risk. I think one of the only things that's really interesting is where the Biden administration made some headway with countries like Brazil, which are incredibly proud of being non-aligned, was to say, you're very proud of being non-aligned. Brazilian diplomats will often joke, we're so non-aligned, we refuse to join the non-aligned movement. We're only observers, which is true. You can check it on Google. So the American argument on the Biden was to Brazil and the Indians, for example, you're very proud of being non-aligned, and yet you're being dragged into this anti-Western, China-dominated group, the BRICS. Does that fit your non-aligned kind of worldview? I think that's, it had some purchase. I think that's over with Trump for now. Kaiser Kuo, so I don't know the context of what he said. China wanting to be a civilization, not a state. There's a version of that which comes from a guy, Martin Jakes, who's basically a pro-China Marxist in the UK, who I don't have a tremendous amount of time for. That's fine if it's just a kind of description of China having an old culture, but I worry about civilizational legitimacy. This idea that China as a civilization is used by Communist Party propagandists and ideologues to say that, and Xi Jinping gives speeches about this, that because China has always had what he calls the oldest unbroken civilization in the world, it can only be run in Chinese ways, that it cannot follow a Western path, that it cannot be any different from how it is, that it's this kind of closed ontological loop, that as a civilization rather than a state, China will always be Chinese because it has always been Chinese, and it's kind of impervious to external criticism. And I think we as outsiders, and I hope my lecture explained this, we need to be very humble about our ability to make China more like us, or China's willingness to be more like us. But as a very basic point, China's own laws don't allow some of the things that the Chinese security forces do to Chinese people. China used to have a freer press than it does now. China used to give minorities, ethnic nationalities, far greater rights, bilingual education, than it does now. So even if you only follow China's own policies in a China led by the Communist Party, things have become more repressive. And to claim that this is just the way we always are because it's civilizational legitimacy, well, that's a frightening argument to go down, because then it's utterly impervious to external scrutiny or external arguments, or even to internal checks and balances. So it's a red flag for me when I hear someone saying China is a civilization, not a state. Trump as Mao. Look, when I was in Beijing last week, one of the most striking things was senior, prestigious, famous Chinese scholars who lived through the Cultural Revolution as young people, whose own education was basically destroyed or massively disrupted by the Cultural Revolution, saying, we recognize some of this with Trump. One very famous scholar, I can't use his name because it was a Chatham House Rules event, he said, one of the lessons that I remember from the Mao years was that Mao thought if you destroyed the old system, a new system would automatically emerge to take its place. And we learned that that wasn't what happened. Because, of course, for the Chinese, their memory is that Mao and the Red Guards destroyed universities, they destroyed state institutions, they had this ideological purge for anyone seen as insufficiently loyal to Mao, and then what followed was anarchy and chaos and bloodshed until Mao died in 1976. So when they make that comparison, that is not a flattering comparison to Trump. This is not the time or the place in terms of, I don't have the time to say, yeah, look, I worry greatly. I've lived in America for 10 years of my life. My kids are Americans. My wife's an American. I love this country dearly. I'm an Atlanticist. But what is happening right now is that line I quoted about Truman, saying that America totally defeated its enemies, and then brought them back into the community of nations. Only America could do that. That's not the whole story of the Cold War, but it is true. It was remarkable. That was part of the story. America wasn't a colonial empire. It did do something different. And that generosity of spirit, that self-confidence, I really worry that we have seen that, disappear in this kind of grievance-based, resentful America that says that, Europe was created as a project to screw America. America should be more self-confident. Doesn't have to regard every alliance as a kind of burden. And so I am profoundly, profoundly worried about where we're going and where this goes next. Taiwan, it's an important question. Is there going to be a war soon? So I don't think that the conditions are there for a war in the next kind of very short term, because I think that in part we would need to see the Chinese public prepared with propaganda to be told that the Taiwanese are led by dangerous separatists and splitists who are making it intolerable, because there will be enormous economic costs to even a blockade, even a kind of conflict which leads to sanctions on China. Even if it's not a full-on amphibious invasion like D-Day, for China to take Taiwan, even if it was about a sort of a long blockade that brings Taiwan to its knees, there's then a painful, coercive peace deal where the Taiwanese, come together and basically allow China to take over. That would be an incredibly painful, brutal experience to play out. We've seen this play out in a much less dramatic way in Hong Kong after the protests in 2019. The national security law, the push to have, you cannot run for any office in Hong Kong now as district councillor up to chief executive without swearing allegiance to the Communist Party of China. There is no opposition in the Hong Kong Legislative Council, their mini parliament. They only have what they call patriots governing Hong Kong. To have anything like that model in Taiwan, you would need to basically take an island, a country that has held fully competitive elections since 2000. I was there for the first election in 2000 where it was a proper, full, free election. You'd have to reverse that. You'd have to say to people in Taiwan, you don't get to vote for all of the parties, only the patriotic ones. You'd have to have trials of democratic activists, of opposition leaders, of the DPP, as we've seen in Hong Kong. I think if that happened on our TVs and America did nothing, I think the blow to America's credibility as a defender of any kind of democratic value would be absolutely astonishing. And so I think there would be, and the view of China locking up these people, if they put, the former president Tsai Ing-wen on trial for treason, as they said they would, I think there would be a massive cost. So to prepare the Chinese people for that, you would have to build up the propaganda to extraordinary levels. And what we see is the opposite. Right now, China is clearly trying to retain room for maneuver. So you're seeing this very interesting double strategy. On the one hand, very aggressive military exercises, including this week, in response to what they see as provocations from Lai Ching-te, the president in Taiwan, who they see as a dangerous pro-independence force. And so they show, every time they have one of these exercises, their ability to choke off Taiwan and control it. It's a very visible demonstration. But if you look at Chinese state media in China, when Lai Ching-te won the election in the spring of last year, they didn't go berserk. They didn't say to the Chinese public, this is an absolute outrage. For the third time in a row, the pro-independence party has won the presidency. They played it down. They said, well, he didn't actually win a very good victory. He didn't win the parliament, the legislative yuan. There's only a minority of Taiwanese who believe in independence. The majority is still on our side. Actually, they were more optimistic than the reality. The reality is not nearly as pro-Chinese as that. And so in the short term, China is trying to keep nationalist public opinion at bay in China because they don't want the pressure from public opinion to try and to limit their room for maneuver. But over the 5-10-year time frame, I'm a lot less hopeful. And I think one other reason why I don't think there's going to be a war right now is that if you think there's a chance that Donald Trump might give it to you in a negotiation, why fight him for it? I mean, if he might sell it out for soybeans, why risk the PLA Navy? You spend a lot of money on those aircraft carriers. And so I think for the moment, the danger is not there. But there are versions of Trump too, where you see the hawks come in and spend more money on defense and give more arms to Taiwan and encourage more contacts with Taiwan that could get quite dangerous. And over the 10-year window, I'm pretty pessimistic. And I'll tell you why, and I'll end, that my analysis of Taiwan over the years is that the passage of time works differently it works in two different ways. When it comes to Xi Jinping looking at Taiwan, waking up every morning deciding, do I need to do something or not? With every passing day, with every passing week and hour and year, the balance of power the military balance of power is in China's favor. The PLA keeps getting stronger. Its ability to coerce Taiwan gets more impressive and more visible. And so that's a reason to be patient. That's a reason to wait. So that should calm us down. But with every passing year, every time I visited Taiwan, the hearts and minds of the people on Taiwan are drifting away from mainland China, particularly young Taiwanese. It's not just like a sort of partisan argument to tell them now that, do you think you're Chinese and should be run by the mainland from Beijing? For a lot of young Taiwanese, it's kind of weird. It's like, no. They're kind of scary, no. And so there's actually complacency, a lot of complacency in Taiwan about, oh, they'll never attack us, they're just weird and different and they're not our problem. And so that means the passage of time is getting worse for China, that they can't necessarily wait forever. And so I do worry that at some point, if there is a way of doing this without a full-on war that risks everything, if there's a way of choking off Taiwan and trying to strangle Taiwan, I think I can't rule that out. And I think that I love Taiwan. I think it's a fantastic place. I think it's very corrupt, it's very noisy, but it's a genuine democracy. It's a very raucous democracy. It's sometimes, fists are thrown and there's some gangsters in parliament, but it's the real deal. It is a democracy. And I think that history, the lessons of history, snuffing out a democracy and cancelling its ability to have free elections, it's happened in human history. It's happened in Czechoslovakia. It's happened in the Baltic republics. But it doesn't happen without violence. It's never happened peacefully. And so I think over the long term, sorry, that's a very gloomy note to end on, but the long term, I am a bit worried.
Well, how about we end this way? Let's thank David Rennie once more. If you are interested in this event, we do many others. Please visit us at eastasia.wisc.edu and look at the remaining events on our semester calendar. Thank you very much.